Last time we dealt with chapter 10 and the end of Saul's reign. And in these two chapters, 11 and 12 of Chronicles, we're dealing with the transferring of the kingdom over to David. And as Selman notes here, these two chapters are a single unit with a clear literary design. The programmatic theme of David's recognition as king by the whole of Israel introduces and concludes the whole unit. In other words, the similar phrasing really forms this as a literary unit that combines these two sections. And in fact, concerning some of that, Lightheart notes that at the end, so we have 9 chapters of genealogy. We have the end of Saul's reign in chapter 10. But from here on out, for the rest of Chronicles, we have a pretty clear chiastic type design. I think B and B prime are a bit of a stretch, but the rest of it fits very nicely. So I think we should go ahead and go with the chiastic structuring. But let's just take a look at it, because this will give us a roadmap for the rest of First Chronicles. So here in A, we have David being made king in chapter 11, and that's mirrored by A prime when Solomon is made king in chapter 29. B, we have David's Gibborim, his mighty men. These are the people that are going to defect over to David, essentially, in chapters 11 and 12. And B prime, we have David's preparation for the temple. And I don't think that mirrors perfectly well. And this also is 7 chapters, as opposed to the 2 of David's Gibborim. But the rest of it fills in pretty nicely. So in C, we have the failed attempt to bring the ark in chapter 13. And in C prime, we have the failed census in chapter 21. And these are two, we're going to find their liturgical or theological failings of David, and that they mirror each other fits very nicely. D, we have war with the Philistines in chapter 14. D prime, we have more wars, also the Philistines, involved in chapters 18 and 20. And that puts at the center of First Chronicles David and the ark in chapters 15 through 17. And if you remember, if you watched earlier, we dealt a little bit with the genealogies. And in there, we found that in those first 9 chapters, the Levites, who are dealing with worship and those kinds of ideas, were the center of the genealogies. And so that the center of the rest of the narrative section is David and the ark is very fitting. So we're just going to read out the first couple of verses here. There's a couple of things I want to get to. We're certainly not going to deal with everything verse by verse, because there are a lot of lists in these 2 chapters. So we'll just kind of comment on things as we move along. But there's a surprising amount of things in these 2 chapters. So let's just begin. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. We'll just leave it off there for now and just kind of comment on some things along the way. We're just going to kind of scrub through some of these notes and not read the entire thing here. But what Selman is noting in his commentary is that the chronicler held out hope that all of Israel would be brought together post-exile, right? So even the Samaritans, everybody would be ultimately brought in. Of course, none of this ends up happening, either with David or one of these subsequent kings, and they really didn't have kings after the exile either. Of course, he's pointing out, though, that this does become a possibility in Christ, and there are Jews and Samaritans who put their faith in Jesus, John 4, Acts 8. So they began this unifying process that basically culminates in Acts 2, Pentecost, when you have 3,000 Jews from every nation under heaven. So the point is, a lot of this actually finally gets its fulfillment in the New Testament in Christ. Specifically, you start beginning to see this in a little bit in John's Gospel, but mostly in Acts is where you're going to find this. Now, for the time being, we're actually going to skip over the bone and flesh language. That's actually what I want to hit on. But there's something lower that we'll loop back to that point. But here in this language of leading out and bringing in, there's actually a surprising amount here. So Han in his commentary notes, in this imagery may also be a more subtle connection to the exodus and to the conquest of the land. The peoples claim it was you that led out and brought in Israel, recalls language of Moses' commissioning of Joshua to lead out and bring in the people, so that Israel would not be as sheep which have no shepherd. Numbers 27, 16, and 17. The image may be rooted in Israel's understanding of God's mighty work in the Exodus, which on occasion was likened to that of a shepherd's leading in and bringing out. And he lists here Deuteronomy 6:23. The rare use of shepherd imagery to describe God's kingship seems almost always to be in the context of God's leading of the people out of Egypt. And here he lists a number of verses, and then commenting just below this on the phrase "the shepherd of my people Israel." That is Scott Hahn continues. The covenant event at Hebron is also cast in Mosaic terms, so it's reminiscent of the Exodus. It's also reminiscent of Moses as well. There's a Moses typology. The people refer to an oracle in which God declares to David, "You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel." That's in verse 2. My people recalls the Exodus and the Sinai covenant, Exodus 3:7 and 6:7. Let my people go, and that kind of language shows up a lot in Exodus. The shepherd image, which the chronicler carries over from his sources, looks backward to Moses, the archetypal leader of Israel, who was a shepherd in the image of God and is called the shepherd of Israel. And here he lists a number of times that happens. But this imagery also looks forward. The prophets of the exile had foretold the coming of a new shepherd, a new Davidic king. Of course, this is messianic. It finds its fulfillment in Christ. This shepherd image will recur in the great dynastic oracle of 1 Chronicles 17, where it again identifies David with God in a way that no other biblical figure is related to God. And here he quotes another commentator who says, no specific king in Israel is described in shepherd imagery as Yahweh's royal representative, with the exception of David before he assumed the throne. The Old Testament tends to reserve shepherd imagery for Yahweh and significantly extends its use only for Yahweh's Davidic appointee. And it's interesting to note that in the New Testament, we largely don't see the shepherd imagery. It picks up a little bit with Jesus, but after that point, it drops out. The imagery shifts and becomes fishers of men, because the shepherd imagery is insular. You're dealing with an in-group people. Whereas in the New Testament, it's about going out and bringing people into the group. And so the metaphor of going out and fishing is used, and it makes sense as well because the Gentile nations are often depicted or were depicted in the Old Testament. Sometimes in some of the imagery, the symbolism was that of the ocean or the waters, that kind of thing. And so it's bringing those people in. But largely, the imagery does drop out ultimately with Jesus. But it begins here with David and recalls back to the Exodus and to Moses. Picking up at verse 4, and David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. And they say, nuh-uh. David says, uh-huh. They take the city. And here it talks about Joab is essentially, he's given preeminence because he basically took the city, or he's kind of the first one over the wall, so to speak. And it deals here with them rebuilding the city. And we'll pick up on some of this imagery. But here, noting on David and all of Israel, Scott Hahn makes the point that the conquest here of Jerusalem, it's the first act of David and all of Israel, is them taking Jerusalem. So that's kind of significant, because that all of Israel language is picked up a lot in Chronicles, but continuing on with Han, he makes a very interesting point here because he's asking why Jerusalem, where it didn't seem to be given a lot of attention prior. The settlement wasn't. It didn't seem super important. So why Jerusalem? Why is it so important that David take it and it becomes the capital? And Scott Hahn answers, one, typologically. David experienced a manifestation of the divine presence at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, which is, of course, Jerusalem. And he's referring to 1 Chronicles 21, which we haven't got to yet, obviously, which is explicitly linked with Abraham and the Akedah in 2 Chronicles 3:1. So if you looked at that passage, it mentions Mount Moriah, and the only other mention of Mount Moriah in the Bible is Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. And so it links that site, that theophanic appearance of the angel of the Lord, with these two sites where they eventually build the temple and where you had the near sacrifice of Isaac, the only son of Abraham. Of course, looking into the future, this is also going to be roughly the same mountain range where Jesus, the only son of God, is ultimately crucified. Continuing on with Han, the second reason is Melchizedek. The choice of Jerusalem and David's priestly cultic understanding of his kingship is rooted in the mysterious figure of Melchizedek, the king of Salem, that is, Jerusalem, and priest of the God Most High, who brought out bread and wine and blessed Abraham in the name of the maker of heaven and earth. I mean, this is so theologically pregnant. We tend to focus on the fact that Abraham tithed 10% to Melchizedek, but Melchizedek gave Abraham bread and wine, which is very theologically pregnant with Eucharist kind of symbolism, the body, the blood. And this isn't the only time we see this kind of bread and wine imagery. One of my favorite examples is Judges 6, the call of Gideon, where you have Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press. So he's making bread in the place he normally make wine. The angel of the Lord appears to him, and there he's commissioned. But here it's just a very subtle foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Continuing on with Han, the identification of Melchizedek's Salem with David's Jerusalem is made in the Psalms, as is the identification of Melchizedek's priesthood and the priesthood of the Davidic kings. Psalm 110, specifically verse 4. David understood himself as a sort of new Melchizedek, and in the canon, Melchizedek represents a mysterious connection with Adam, the primal priest king, and I want us to take note of that, the first priest. Before we go any further, I do want to note this point by Johnstone concerning the phrase, that is Jebus. He says, it's not just a note to explain the name of the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Jebusites, about to be mentioned. Rather, the point is to mark a sharp break between the past and the future. The radical discontinuity between Jebus, which has been occupied up till now by one of the nations of the world, the Hamites, according to 1 Chronicles 1:14, and we may want to take note of that, and Jerusalem, which will be inhabited henceforth by Israel, the people of God. Thus, that is Jebus in verse 4 is counterbalanced by that is the city of David in verse 5. Okay, now I said I wanted to loop back to this point regarding the language of the bone and flesh. And so we're going to pick up with Han's commentary on page 49. He says, David's covenant with the people is expressed in physical, familial, and even nuptial terms. He is one flesh with the people, his heart knit together with theirs. Indeed, we should pause over the covenantal formula used at Hebron, we are your bone and flesh. The expression harkens back to the nuptial exclamation of Adam. This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And that is Genesis 2:23. It is used on rare occasions elsewhere to signify covenantal or blood kinship or physical existence. But if an Adamic typology is at work for the chronicler, use of this expression here may have a deeper significance. And I'm going to agree here. Could the chronicler be making a comparison between the union of Israel and its head? Do we see here an attempt to interpret the origins of the bridal imagery used by the prophets to describe Israel's relationship with God? And here he lists a number of prophets that use this imagery. Does David, as king, stand in the relationship of bridegroom to God's betrothed Israel? My sense is that the answer to each of these questions is yes, but this cannot be proved definitively. Now, I actually read this quotation before in a different video, the one on the sin of Ham and the curse of Canaan, Genesis 9, where I argued that part of what's underlying that story is the attack on the bride motif. And that motif begins with Adam and Eve, where Adam fails to protect Eve, his bride. It's very interesting because we'll switch gears here for a second and go to 1 Kings chapter 6. And we'll go also to Genesis roughly 2, I think 21. And here we have, so the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, that's Adam. And while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man he made, literally built, into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Now, what's interesting about this, and others have noted this before, is some of this language, the vocabulary is unique. So the well-known rib of Adam, it's really kind of a poor translation because everywhere else, this term, rib, is generally going to refer to the site of sacred architecture. Let's make this really small so we can see all of the references. So as you can see here, it populates where, and this is the construction of Solomon's temple, of the Solomonic temple. And as you can see, this term for rib used here in Genesis 2 is used over here. It's also used with, let's see if I can find it. You'll have to bear with me for a second because it's towards the end of Exodus. Let's also make sure this is small. Yeah, it's pretty small. And I may have to click on it again. And I think it's up here. So here you go again with part of the altar for the burnt offerings, part of the altar of incense. And that might be, oh yeah, up here, part of the Ark of the Covenant. So again, this is the term used here for rib, but this isn't the only one. Obviously, like I mentioned, made is literally built, and here it populates all over the place in our King's account. I'm not sure if it shows up here in the Exodus account. It may or may not. I'm not sure. I don't remember. And then this language here about the, yeah, it's tough to see the highlight here, but it's this term right here is the same as over here for the place that's closed up with flesh. But what do we make of this? The more I've thought about it, I think that this is a very early typology of Christ and the church. And I noted in that Genesis 9 video, this deep sleep language is very rare. Some commentators take this as kind of an early type of death and resurrection. And since woman is called the glory of man, you could think of it this way, that Adam dies and then is brought back to life, is resurrected to glory, to his bride that is built out of him. And again, it was his death like sleep that brought this about. And I argued there in that video that Noah is something of the antitype because we're not told he goes to sleep, but we are told he wakes up. He awakens and finds out what his son has done to him. So it's a reverse of this in that he wakes up to shame. His son has shamed him. And I believe it's a violation not of Noah specifically, but of his wife. And again, you'd have to watch that video to see all the details. Of course, all of this is looking forward to when Christ dies and resurrects to his church. His church is built from his resurrection, from his death and resurrection. And I think all of this is a subtle nod to that, if you will. what this has to do with First Chronicles 11 specifically is, again, it's part of that typology of Israel being the bride, the king being the head, and I think it's evoked here in this language of bone and flesh, but also here down at the end of this chapter. So we have this note here that that Joab, or that they built the city all around from the Millo in complete circuit, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. This term here, repaired, is very odd to use in construction language. And the Faith Life Study Bible notes here that the word means to bring back to life, and they reference Psalm 30 verse 3 specifically. It's kind of a well-known psalm. Let's just go ahead and look at it. Psalm 30 verse 3. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life among those who go down to the pit. And it's this language here of you restored me to life. And in fact, if we were to run a search here, and let's go make sure we're searching in Hebrew, and here we have all the occurrences. And if I were to go through these, there's a better view of looking at this, but I'm not going to do it now anyway. But I have done this, and I've looked through these, and I was not able to find any other occurrence of this term referring to something that's not a person or something that's living. So here in Chronicles, this seems to be a unique usage of the term to refer to a building or to the city of David, as a person. And given, again, coupling that up with the bone and flesh language above, and going back to some of the other Adamic typologies, Melchizedek, his associations with this city, I can't help but wonder if some of this is not in play here. Adam as the first priest who was supposed to protect his bride. And here you have, again, David, in a sense, recapturing the bride. And it should be noted that they captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And as we noted earlier, remember I said, take note of this, the original inhabitants were Hamites. And again, who violated the wife of Noah? Who violated the bride of Noah? Ham. And again, I think it's part of this theme of the attack on the bride. And so here you have, like I said, the bride being recaptured by David in all of Israel. It's the first thing all of Israel does together, is to take Jerusalem, to take it away from the descendants of Ham, who once upon a time violated Noah's wife. But I can't help but wonder if some of this stuff isn't connected. I know you're not going to find a scholar that is willing to go there, because they tend to need a lot more in the text to connect passages. But the way I look at Scripture, I think it's all, since God is ultimately the author, I think he can make these connections in very subtle ways. And so I'm willing to go in those directions. Again, I know most commentators are not, but hey, I am. But I just thought it was interesting and worth thinking about. From here on out, I think we can kind of scrub through a lot of the stuff, because, like I said, it's eventually going to turn into a lot of lists, but there is some interesting stuff, so we'll just hit on some of these things. We'll pick up here in this phrase, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Johnstone has an interesting note in page 148 of his commentary. He says that here that this phrase, or this title, Lord of Hosts, used here for the first time in Chronicles, and again it's only used in 1 Chronicles 17 verses 7 and 4, or 24 rather, provides one of the most important examples of sacramental thinking. The hosts in the title are the cosmic powers available to God for the realization of his purposes. Israel's armies are the earthly counterpart to these cosmic forces. And by the way, I can't help but note, again, if you came in from one of the, from either one of the genealogies videos, or the one where we noted that the pre-antediluvians, or the antediluvians, the people before the flood, how their ages seem to have these correspondences to astronomical cycles and periods. And I noted in that video that Barnween also made the argument that the numbers in the book of Numbers, the census numbers, have also astronomical underpinnings. And I argue that it has to do with the people of God being related to the heavenly host. So God's people are like the divine, again, the cosmic powers. We become part of God's family and we become part of God's army and that kind of idea. And so, again, this is interesting in light of that the armies of Israel and later, again, believers are the earthly counterparts of the cosmic forces. But continuing on with Johnstone, the earliest occurrence of the title in the Hebrew Bible is in 1 Samuel in association with the sanctuary at Shiloh and the Ark of God, where it is connected with the wars which God wages on behalf of his people against their enemies. Though the chronicler does not reproduce the narratives from Samuel, it had been in the name of the Lord of hosts that David had confronted Goliath. From that day, David had indeed gone from strength to become Israel's leader in fighting the battles of the Lord. The title then expresses the effective zeal of the Lord on behalf of his people and the war he wages on their enemies, the control he exercises over the destinies of the nations, and his upholding of justice, even for the oppressed individual. Within this context, even the preposition with, in the affirmation that the Lord of hosts was with David, takes on significance. As noted in 1 Chronicles 5:20, it cross-refers to the expectations associated with the messianic name Emmanuel, that is, God with us. Worth noting the typological connection here, that God was with David. But then later we do have the true Messiah, Jesus, who is literally God with the people. Like I said, I'm mostly just going to skip around and pick up on things. So worth noting in here is the fact that what we read through these military exploits, that these things are going to disqualify David from being the eventual temple builder because he has blood on his hands, that kind of thing. However, these things actually provide the material that they're later going to use to build the temple. So it does have a positive dimension in it. We'll pick up here with the story in verse 12, where you have Eleazar, the son of the unfortunately named Dodo. So let's pick up on verse 13. He was with David at Pasdamim when the Philistines were gathered there for battle. There was a plot of ground full of barley, and the men fled from the Philistines. And so he and David defend this plot of land after the other men had fled. Both Lightheart and Johnstone make a similar observation that the barley, as Lightheart notes, Passover takes place at the barley harvest. So the salvation they achieved is linked with the delivery from Egypt. And Johnstone similarly notes this. And is pointing out how between Chronicles and Samuel, the specific Chronicles specifically mentions barley here. And so he thinks it has to do with Passover, unleavened bread, the festival of the barley harvest, commemorating the deliverance of Israel from Egypt at the Exodus. And he continues to note that territory, even if it is only a barley field, has been recovered from the representative power of the nations, that is the Philistines. The long, slow process of the restoration of the land has begun. And now, if you read throughout these chapters, you're going to keep coming across the language of the 30. And Merrill makes this point. The 30 is probably akin to the name of an elite force, a palace guard unit, or the like. It is not to be taken too precisely, though Samuel has 29. And Myers similarly noted that 30, it could come from Egypt, whose administration machinery David borrowed more than one feature. We could pick up in the story here in verse 17, where David says longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." And so some of the mighty men actually break through a camp barrier of the Philistines, and they bring David some water. But David would not drink it. He poured it out before the Lord and said, "Far be it from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the lifeblood of these men? For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore David would not drink it. These things did the three mighty men." Now, I always thought that the story was kind of odd, but Lightheart notes here that that the water was virtually the blood of the men who risked their lives to get it, and David treats it like blood, pouring it on the ground. David will not refresh himself by sending his men to death. Before he becomes king, he proves himself an ideal king. He will defend a barley field to feed his people. He will not exploit the bold prowess of his mighty men for personal pleasure. His men take risks, but he will not make them spear fodder. And Johnston similarly notes that he treats this as blood. He quotes here Deuteronomy 12:16, which it's speaking that you shouldn't eat the blood, you should pour it out like water on the earth, is the language it uses in Deuteronomy. The story in verse 22 is kind of interesting with Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. He struck down 2 heroes of Moab. He also went down and struck down a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. And he also struck down an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits tall. I think that's roughly 7'5". The Egyptian had in his hand a spear like a weaver's beam, which is exactly the way Goliath is described. I bring this up because this phrase is kind of difficult. The Faith Life Study Notes has a good point here. It says the Hebrew word used here for heroes, Ariel, is very similar to the word for lion, Ari. The author uses this wordplay to say that Benaiah killed 2 lion-like men from Moab, as well as an actual lion. Because there's a lot of translation difficulty in this passage, but I think I think it basically could be a pun, and that's really what's going on. From Jacob Myers, this is worth considering. We won't read the quotation, but throughout these chapters, you're dealing with a bunch of people defecting over to David, but it's worth thinking about geographically, these people are coming from all over, and they're coming to David's banner, essentially. So now we're in chapter 12, and this section is full of people that came over to help David, and this language here is all over the place. You can see, as you can see, most of these names, many of these names, part of their name basically means help or to help. And so it's all over the place in this section. And Lightheart also noted something like a numerological connection. We've actually noted this in the genealogy video, that you have 26 names, which is the numerical value of the divine name, Yahweh. As Lightheart puts, your God helps you, Amasai says later down in this chapter, and he surely does, sending a Yahweh number of men from Benjamin over to David. And we'll pick up here with the Gadites. And Johnstone notes here that it's probably, there's an old pun involved in this section here. Let's just go ahead and look at the passage it's referring to. So Genesis 49:19, and raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. And this footnote says Gad sounds like the Hebrew for raiders and raid. And so that may be coming up in part of this section. But worth noting here is that the place of origin, this is, as Johnstone notes, the Gadites belong to the East Bank tribes. Their arrival at Ziklag, deep in the West Bank, to lend massive 11-fold help alongside the Benjaminites, represents the beginning of the new definitive conquest and settlement of all Israel in the land under one new national leader, David. And here he's going to note that there's an unmistakable verbal reminiscent of the account of the beginning of the original conquest and settlement in the land under Joshua 3:5. In verse 15, they crossed the Jordan in the first month when it was overflowing all its banks. Hahn makes a similar observation here. So Hahn says on page 56, and there are strong hints that the chronicler intends to recreate or at least evoke the scene of original conquest throughout his arc narrative. He has already made a brief allusion to this history in his summary of the Gadites who joined David's army, as did the people led by Joshua and the priests bearing the ark in Joshua 3:11 through 4:1. These Gadites passed over the Jordan at the time of the year when the Jordan was overflowing all its banks. In the narrative of the ark's return, the chronicler evokes the beginnings of Israel's journey from Sinai to the Jordan. As with Numbers 10, the ark narrative has a summoning of the kahal, the blowing of trumpets, the interval of 3 days during the course of the journey, reference to glad festivals, sacrifices of burnt offerings and peace offerings, and the theme of rest for the ark of the Lord. Continuing with Han, Gad settled in the Transjordan. And to join David at Ziklag, they have to cross the river. And again, he notes here it's at its height when it was overflowing. And this brings to mind Joshua, the crossing when they entered the land. Again, Joshua 3:15, 4:18, so on and so forth. Which itself obviously brings to mind the original crossing of the Red Sea. Continuing further down, again, you have people defecting over from specifically Benjamin is mentioned. Again, this is Saul's kinsman. And of course, David, as such, is a bit skeptical of them. And it says here that the Spirit clothed Amasiah. And he says, "We are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you." On this phrase here, though, the Spirit clothing him, Johnstone notes that he is seized with an ecstatic possession by the divine Spirit. The same formula is used in Chronicles of Zechariah and 2 Chronicles 24:20. Outside of Chronicles, it is used of Gideon in Judges 6:34. And for a similar expression, 1 Chronicles 5:26. God himself is indeed controlling the response and vindicating David. Continuing further down, this is interesting that this language of a great army like the army, or like an army of God, because this phrase only occurs here and in Genesis 32:2. And it's literally camp, the term. And Selman noted that the phrase in Hebrew is literally like the camp or army of God, perhaps hinting at unseen divine support, as in the only other occurrence, and that's Genesis, again, 32:2. Johnstone is going to echo similar ideas that the camp, it brings to mind the wilderness sojourn, the military campaigns, but more yet, once again, sacramental thinking is in evidence. The campaigns of David are wholly in consonance with the campaigns of God himself with his people. The camp of David is none other than the camp of God. And again, he's going to note Genesis 32:2 for the identification of the camp of Israel with the camp of the Lord, 2 Chronicles 14:13, and Psalm 78:28. Compare the meaning of the Lord of hosts in 1 Chronicles 11:9. We already went through that language. And this brings to mind one point that I'm not sure if we went over, and that's that Johnstone believes that this covenant process was done before the Ark of the Covenant because of some of the unique language used there. Let's actually just bring back the beginning of this section, because in 1 Chronicles 11, they make a covenant before the Lord. Now, we're not told anything else about how this covenant was carried out, but he's bringing up the fact that some of this language is unique, and you actually have the Lord of hosts, which is an Ark of the Covenant type phrase that gets brought up all the time. And so he believes that that's actually, it was the Ark of the Covenant was part of the covenant process. So the fact that the Ark and some of the themes and symbols that come along with it keep being evoked is probably not coincidental. It's probably because the Ark was used as part of this covenant making process. Also, Johnstone had an interesting note here about these are the numbers of the divisions of the armed troops. But Johnstone notes here that the Masoretic text divides the section into 14 paragraphs, essentially an introduction followed by a paragraph for each tribe, but with some variation. And I note this only because if you've, again, followed from any of the previous videos, specifically the genealogy one, the number 14, and associated with people defecting over to David, that should make your ears perk up, basically, because 14 is the numeric value of David's name. When Matthew does a triple 14 structured genealogy of Jesus, it may not be unprecedented what he's doing there, because it may actually have precedence specifically here, but maybe not, but it is worth thinking about. And so we have all the people defecting over to David, unifying under David's banner, and that will take us into chapter 13, where they're going to attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Jearim, and that is going to be the first failure of David. But we'll pick up that story next time.